Hey everyone, what is going on? Welcome back to another video here on the channel. In this week's video, we're going to be taking a look at my process as to how I solder connectors on for a speed run vehicle. Now, it's not necessarily important or critical that we're talking about specifically a speed run vehicle. This is a process that I use for essentially all the connectors to get them on the battery. And no, you don't need a lot of equipment to do this. What you really want to invest in as a primary piece of equipment is a good soldering iron. I would recommend if you're going to be soldering big bullet connectors such as 7mm or larger, you will want one that is of 100 watts or more. This is going to give you a good, reliable, quick soldering amount of time in order to dump a lot of heat into the connector so that you can finish the job and then pull that soldering iron and the heat away from your connector. This is very critical and important for those of you that are soldering connectors that have a resistor to give you that anti-spark feature so that you don't hear the snap, crackle, pop when you plug in batteries to your electronic speed control. I highly recommend also getting a plug and using a plug that uses that, especially if you're going to be operating on 8S or more in terms of the voltage that you're plugging in to your ESC. Now, what we're going to be dealing with here today is this battery pack. It is an 8,000 milliamp hour 4S pack. Not that that necessarily matters. Now, this connector here is an EC5. We don't have any purpose or need for the EC5. We're going to get rid of the EC5 and we're going to be using some bullet connectors that are of the size 7mm, and these here are great connectors. I believe they're called the AS150s, AS150 connector, and they do have a resistor component. Now, the resistor that we have in our setups is not part of the battery side of the connection. That is soldered onto the ESC, so we won't see that being used here. So we don't necessarily need to worry about heat so much as we're going through our process here today. We want to certainly avoid getting the battery pack hot, but it is quite far away from where we're actually making the soldering connection here today. So we're going to go through that process. What I have here on the whiteboard that you do see in some of the videos is a list of the steps that I need to follow. If I don't follow these steps, I'm going to run into a problem where I'm not getting the proper step done, and we may have to take apart the connector and redo things. Now, I say that because I have done that several times, and let me know in the comment section. I know a few of you are out there. If you solder everything up and then you realize you forgot something and you have to pull it all apart again, I bet a lot of us have actually been through that when soldering connectors or any other soldering that we are doing. So I have a good step here to follow, and there's about 9 steps to complete one side or one connector side, and we're going to go through what my steps look like here in this video. Let's get started and talk about what we're doing. So the first thing that we want to do is look at our battery pack, make sure that we got everything set up so that we can get connectors here on this battery. We need our soldering iron, we need some flux, we need the solder, we need a brush to allow us to get some flux here onto certain components that we're wishing to solder, and then we need a setup, a base as to where we're going to actually do this. Here we're doing the soldering in the studio, so that means we are going to just place down a simple soldering mat as well as this piece of wood. I prefer this setup when I'm doing a soldering job where it's not on a bench where I have all the equipment. From here, you may want some side cutters to make cutting a little bit easier. You may also want some pliers to help out later if you need to grab something. And then I do use vice grips to hold parts if I don't want them to move. So generally speaking, this is all the equipment you really need to get started. Now, one thing that you will want to do is get a fan that's going to help pull away some soldering smoke as it develops, as the flux begins to melt and burn off. You want to have a fan. I have the fan going up above, and I have some good ventilation in the room to pull air out of the room in 2 different ways, so that should help out with the smoke as well that comes from this soldering process. Now, I'm going to follow the steps on the board. As I've said, the first step that we're going to be going through is we want to prepare everything. We've done that. We want to start up our soldering iron here in a second. And then the next item here is we want to cut one lead of our battery pack off, and we want to do this one at a time. I'm going to go ahead and start off with our negative lead. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut it in this area here. I don't need to save absolutely every bit of wire, and I want to bury the wire in the jaws of these side cutters, just where the blade essentially ends. This is going to make it easier because cutting through this wire does take a good amount of bite. although this is not the most heavy duty wire there is. So now that I have this lead exposed, what I want to make sure is that I don't make a connection between this negative and this positive. This is why we're going to leave this connector on. This is a female connector, so it's very well shrouded, and there should be no way that we actually are able to short this connector out with the bare wire that we have now just exposed. Now the next thing that we want to do according to our list is we want to expose the wire that we are going to want to solder. Now here you generally use wire strippers. If you don't have wire strippers in the vicinity of your studio, then probably what you want to do is use the next best thing, which is scissors. Now I'll show you how I do this because you do have to be careful so that you don't cut metal. The metal under here, which represents the wire that we're going to expose, comes in very thin strands, and it's very easy to cut those strands. And you don't want to do that because if you cut enough of them, then it reduces the effectiveness of that wire. So what I do is I get about the size that I want. I'm going to cut maybe, a 1/4 inch or so. I'm going to strip the end of the insulation off. I'm going to apply a small amount of pressure, and I'm just going to go around in a couple circles very, very lightly. And when I start to see a little bit of exposed metal, I can stop. So I start to see a little bit of exposed metal, I can stop. Now I can just use my finger, my thumb to pull this off. If it is a little bit difficult to pull off, that means you've essentially done it correctly, because you're not stripping off any of the wire. And then you can take a look inside this little bit of insulation to see if there is any wire, and here I do not have any wire, so I know that I have not really pulled off any of the metal strands here using scissors as a wire stripper. Not ideal, gets the job done. So the next thing that we're going to be looking at here is our stranded wire. First thing I want to do with this is twist it in the clockwise direction because this is the way that the strands already seem to be twisting. I'm going to twist them nice and tight. Twisting them nice and tight is going to be making all the steps in the future here very easy to deal with. Once I have those twisted off, I am going to jump into the next step here, which is going to be using flux. We're going to place this flux here on the bare wire, and then we're going to also place it here on one of our connectors. We're going to look at the negative wire is going to get a female plug cover. So this is our female plug cover. Once we have our female plug connector, we want the male plug. So this is the way that it's going to look. And we can see that the insulation is going to butt up to the connector very nicely. So this is the way that you want it. You don't want to have any insulation inside of your connector, and you really don't want insulation that's exposed. So you can place the wire in and just mock that up to make sure that you have the right amount. And you can adjust that. If you cut a little bit too much of the insulation off, you can just simply cut a little bit of the wire off to make up for it. And if you don't have enough insulation cut off, then you can cut more of it off, and you'll expose more wire there as well. So there's always ways that you can fix these certain small little issues as you begin to test and mock things up. So now that we have that done, we're going to expose this. We can place a bunch of flux here onto our connector. So the flux that I'm using, it's going to work very well. I do like to tin the wire, and then I'm going to place some flux here inside of our bullet connector. This is going to help with the soldering job and make things a lot easier for us when we do use flux. Is it necessary? I would say I would highly recommend using this. It just makes things much easier. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put this in the vice grip just to save it for later. Now what I'm doing when I place this into the vice grip is I'm applying a very small amount of gripping force to the connector just to barely hold it. And I'm going to make sure that it is relatively loose. I don't want to put bite marks in any of the exposed metal here on the end, so I'm placing the vice grips and burying them all the way in as far as I possibly can, right up to pretty well the threading of this connector. So that is done. It's just got enough bite to hold it. It still can wiggle loose if you do force it. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to fire up our soldering iron. It does take a quick minute here to get going. We're going to position our battery in a way that makes it a lot easier for us to solder. I prefer just to lay it down, giving me an easy access to the wire and exposing it as far away as possible to all the other stuff that's going on here with the battery. I can also use, bits of the tool here to hold our connector away. And as we're getting ready, we're at 200 degrees Celsius. This is going to ramp up to 300 and something degrees. And now we can start to begin to get the solder here on our soldering iron. So we're going to get some solder here on the iron. And we're going to place that right onto the wire. And I'm just tinning it, so I just want to go around. I'm going to switch hands here. Not often I use the left hand here for soldering. I just want to tin all of the wire around. I'm going to make sure that I cover majority of it. Just get a little bit of solder exposure there. I'm going to grab some more solder, and again, same thing. I'm placing some solder there, and it's looking pretty good. So that is essentially done. So I'm going to go back and refer to my next step here in a second. I'm going to smooth out this. It looks like I got a clump. I don't want any clumps. I want to make sure I keep it nice and smooth. And there we go. So not too bad. It starts to begin to get a little bit warm, and once you're getting the wire warm, obviously it's going to be a little bit more challenging to hold on to. So that's where you can use some of the other tools that you have if you need to do that. So now that we've got that, the next step is we want to insert our plastic cover onto the wire. Very important, because this is often something that I will tend to forget. You're in the moment of soldering, you're thinking soldering, and you forget about the little things that you need to do. If you don't put this guy on right now and you do forget, you're going to be pulling everything apart, and it just doesn't work out well the second time when you go to solder. Things are going to look different, and the job just isn't as clean. So it is a good idea to make sure you're following your list and get your pieces on your setup on the appropriate time, so you don't have to rip and pull everything apart. So I'm going to place this over top of the wire, feed it all the way down to the end, and now I have the wire exposed. I can retest fit our connector, make sure it fits very well, and it absolutely does. So that's looking good. Now see how this does lift a little bit? I don't like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just drop some pliers here to make it come out very straight. Now the next thing I want to do here is follow my list. It now says I am able to solder the connector onto our battery pack. I'm going to grab the soldering gun. I'm going to grab a little bit more solder here, and I can go ahead and allow this to get in there and start to heat up. So this is going to take a fat minute here to get nice and warm. And once this gets nice and hot and begins to melt the solder that's already on the wire, things are going to be easier. I'm going to take the vice grips off now so I can expose a little bit more of the gun. And it looks like that we have it starting to melt our wire. And I can pull off with the gun right now just to see if we got a nice solder patch, and it looks like everything's working very well. So we got a nice flat section of solder covering our wire inside of that connector. I'm going to pull this off. So that is looking very good. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just fill in the cracks with a little bit of solder so that everything is full. I do like to make sure everything is solid and they don't have any exposed holes there. So we're going to do that just by getting a little bit more solder. And we're going to finish off those holes very carefully. We don't want to overdo it. And there you have it. So now that we have that done, you can take a look at what it looks like. It looks like there's a small little bit that I can still get in the corner. It's not going to take much here to just get that little side piece. There it is. That'll help the OCD and everybody. And now that we have all of the major holes pretty well sealed up, this is good to go. Now the next thing that I'm going to do, we don't need this pliers now holding it down. You can see it lifts up the connector that is solid on there. Our next point is to allow this to cool, and then what we want to do is we want to twist this plastic connector over top. Again, we don't go and do that now, because if this metal component ends up melting off our connector, we're in trouble. Then we have to put a new connector on there, which means we got to pull this off, and like I said, it usually doesn't look as clean and pretty when you do it the second time. So we can allow that to cool, and what we want to do next now is get the positive side done. All right, so we just got this connector here. We just fastened it on, allowing it to cool. I did that when it was cool, and it simply just comes over. You slide it all the way to the connector, and then once it hits the connector, you just screw it on clockwise fashion until it bottoms out. I do have to hold the wire as close as possible to the connector and then make sure it's securely on there. So that's how you get the plastic cover on, and then you just check to make sure that there's nothing exposed there and nothing looks to be exposed on the other side. We don't have any wire sticking out. This is good to go. Now we can go ahead and do the exact same thing to the other side. So let's go ahead and do that. First thing I'm going to do is cut off our wire here. So I'm going to do it the exact same length. I'm going to cut it in this area here. and bury it, so I didn't bury it far enough, so we're going to bury it a little bit more, and then it makes it a little bit easier to go and snap that wire off. There is our EC5 connector now removed. Now we can deal with our remaining positive connector here. Next thing we want to do is just expose some of this wire. So we're going to do that by using our scissors and carefully just cutting all the way around. We apply a nice pressure and we're going to cut and slice. Once we see a little bit of exposed wire, which I see now, we can use our fingers to pull this little bit of insulation off, and then we'll see what the connector looks like from here. So it's a little bit difficult here to pull off as I twist and rotate it. That means that we're probably looking pretty good and we don't have any metal pieces of wire strands in our insulation here. So here we have a couple bits of insulation. I can now use this wire to twist and get this ready. I want to make this wire nice and tight. So now that that wire is nice and tight, I can look at my steps here and find out what the next item is. I want to use some flux to begin to get these prepared. So I'm going to go ahead and use some flux here. Paint that on. And what I see that as I'm painting on the flux, I am starting to move around the strands. You want to paint the flux on in the rotation of those strands so that you don't start to expose them. Then on the connector, this is a female connector now that we're dealing with. So I'm going to place some of the flux inside of here and get this ready. So that's all painted. And then I want flux on the inside area here. I want to make sure that I'm not getting any of the flux here on the exposed part of the connector. That means the top side, or most importantly on the threads. If you get flux on those threads, it's going to be very easy for the solder to transfer into those threads, and you absolutely do not want that. Otherwise, our plastic cover here is not going to properly fit on. So very key point to know here so that that does not happen to you. Now we've got to tin the wire as well as make sure that we don't forget to put this plastic cap over. So this is what I'm going to do now. Now generally I do this after I've already tinned the wire. This way I'm avoiding getting anything hot, but it shouldn't matter. We're not going to apply too much heat there. So I'm going to get my soldering gun back up to temperature. And I'm going to start to tin this as soon as the temperature comes up. All right, so here we are. We can get a little bit of solder onto our soldering gun. And I'm going to expose a little bit here, get the solder on, tin the tip of the wire coming from our battery. So we got some solder on there. It's looking pretty good. It's tinned, and just a little bit more on the back side. And I think that's good enough. I'm going to now just clean the tip here of the soldering iron. Make sure that we have a nice, fresh, exposed tip that we can use here. That looks nice. That's going to begin to heat up. Now we can go and insert the wire inside, and it goes in very easy. That's looking good. I want to grab my little small pair of vice grips just to hold it in the meantime. I'm burying the vice grips so that I don't end up making contact on the outside. It doesn't matter for the female connector as much because the male connector here is going inside of the female there. So there we go. Life lesson of how this stuff works if you didn't already figure this out. And I'm going to clamp down lightly. I don't want to overpress. I don't like to press too hard on these connectors and ruin or potentially ruin any of them in this way. So now that we have that figured out, I like the orientation. You know, I'm a little bit OCD on how the angle of the wire is coming out of the connector. It's probably not super critical. It is exposed a little bit. I do see a little bit of metal, but we should be okay there. It's not too bad. I'm going to leave it as is, and now we can go and finish the job by soldering that last bit to our connector. I'm going to grab some solder. And I can dump it in. Looks like it's flooding fairly quickly here. We need lots of good heat. That's going to get things melting, because now we want to remelt the tinned side of the wire. It looks like our soldering iron's dropping to about 347 degrees. So it looks like we got that exposed. I'm going to now release this. And I'm going to hold it in the position that I want. as it's quite melted. And once I see that everything's kind of flooded everywhere, I can release the connector and the gun. And I'm going to hold the connector down. It looks like it wants to pop up. And that should be a really hot solder joint and should be very strong as is. We don't really need to do anything further, but you know, OCD dictates that we need to fill in the small little holes that are exposed, and we're going to do that so we have a nice flush soldering job here. I'm going to grab a little bit more solder here, and we can go ahead and do that. Grab the pliers so I can just roughly hold it where I want it to be. Fill in the small crack. And there you go. So that's essentially it. We got both of those done. That completes these connectors. All we need to do now is wait for this to cool, and then what we can do is drive this last plastic cover up to the connector, and we should be good to go in terms of our battery. Now you can really see there, I'm going to hold it a little bit closer up to our second camera, the solder and how it looks when it's soldered in there, nice and shiny. You can see that. You don't have any dull sort of appearance. A dull sort of appearance is going to be an appearance that is typical of a colder solder joint. So you should be looking for that nice shiny finish. And I do, like I said, like to cover all of the wire so that I know I'm getting connectivity pretty well on every side of that wire. That wire is fully seated in the connector and solder is covering the entire sides of it. I know that I'm going to get maximum connection in those areas. All right, so now that this has cooled off, I can simply just take our plastic cover, I can run it over to the end, and then I'm going to fasten it on into a clockwise position here. So I'm fastening clockwise, and then once we reach the very end, which is coming here, I'm going to give it a little bit of a turn while holding the base of the wire. I don't need to really overdo it, because if I am overdoing it, all I am doing is taking all the strands of wires and just twisting and stressing them way more than is needed. Well guys, that completes how I end up soldering connectors onto my battery. I hope you learned something. Let me know in the comment section below how you do it and what connectors you guys are using. As always, like the video if you do. Don't forget to hit that sub button so that I can see you guys in that next video. Thanks a lot for watching. See you in the next one.